Welcome to everybody who is joining this conversation. We have a really terrific panel today with Paul Hendrickson and Leo Damrosch and Susan Glasser, and I'm Jonathan Alter. And we're going to have a discussion which we welcome you all to join about the process of writing biographies, about the relationship between being a journalist and being a biographer, and how you wear both of those hats, and how each arguably informs the other. And then also, as another theme, to talk about the often interesting, might be one way of putting it, relationship between the professoriate, between professional scholars and journalists, and how that has changed in recent years. I think it's changed in some good ways that we can get into. But that relationship was fraught for a fairly significant period of time. What I'd like to do first is have everybody introduce themselves, starting with Paul and Leo and then Susan, and just give us some sense of what your, in a minute, of what your career has consisted of, and what books you've written lately and are working on now. Why don't we start with you, Paul?
I wish you would have started with me last, Jonathan, but anyway, because I feel honored to be in this company. My name is Paul Hendrickson. For a long time, I was a journalist at the Washington Post. I teach nonfiction journalism at the University of Pennsylvania, but I'm an old shoe leather reporter. And I am proud to say at this very moment, I am making my first reporting trip for a current book. I'm in rural Western Kentucky after having been working from my front porch, metaphorically, figuratively, and literally for 16 months. Here I am in the first reporting trip. I've written a number of books. They're biographies and cultural histories. And if I were highfalutin, I would say trying to understand what it means to be an American. Some do well, others do not do very well. I wrote a book about Ernest Hemingway called Hemingway's Boat, and the most recent book, which got slammed here and there, was about Frank Lloyd Wright called Plagued by Fire. I wrote a book almost 2 decades ago called Sons of Mississippi. To be an immodest jerk, it won the National Book Critics Circle Award. That's way more than you need to know. Onward to the next. Glad to be here.
Leo.
And likewise, Leo Damrosch. The old Sesame Street song, one of these things is not like the others. You are all distinguished journalists, and I've never been a journalist, and it's too late now.
Well, I don't know why I thought you had been. My apologies.
I'm a lifelong academic. I feel like a country mouse in this company. But about 25 years ago, I actually started to move into biography because I decided that literary theory with a capital T was just too great a blight to keep trying to cope with. And biography was a way of talking about human lives in a way that I found much more interesting. So in fact, I've written biographies, except for a brief one about Tocqueville's American trip. The rest are all 18th century figures. And I'll probably talk later about how I envy those of you who write about recent people or even living people, where there's so many more sources of valuable information and where you can interview and pry and go to somebody else. And all I have is documents, and often they don't tell you much or they deliberately conceal. So my challenge is the different one of trying to tease out a plausible story from very uneven evidence.
Tell us the names of some of your books.
The first biography that I wrote, not counting a short one about a strange Quaker martyr, was a biography of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I called it Restless Genius because he really was an astounding genius, self-taught, never went to school for one day of his life. And was enough of an outsider to see the way politics and culture work, I think, much more profoundly than the highly educated philosophes that were his contemporaries. Then I moved on to Jonathan Swift, a very complicated character who definitely kept secrets about everything important in his life. And the older academic Swift biographers just said, well, that's all hearsay and you won't find it in my book. But of course, the most interesting thing is what he was hiding and why. That one actually did get a National Book Critics Circle Award too. Then I wrote, it's not so much a biography, but it's biographically based. It's called Eternity's Sunrise, the imaginative world of William Blake, where I do try to show his strange and increasingly weird thinking emerging from a position of marginality, not just as a poet, but as a working professional artist. Then there's a book called The Club, which is about Samuel Johnson and James Boswell and their circle, an astounding circle. They were friends. They met once a week to socialize. Edmund Burke, Edward Gibbon, Joshua Reynolds. The list goes on and on. Adam Smith, when he was in London, would attend. Right now, I've just finished a tricky project. It's a biography of Giacomo Casanova, which in the age of Me Too is a fraught subject, but it's also overdue for the kind of attention that is not just lip smacking, vicarious appreciation by previous biographers. And I feel pretty good about that one. It'll come out next year.
That's great. Susan?
Well, my goodness, Jonathan, it's great to see you, but I have to say I do feel like the interloper in this mix, and I'm delighted to be here with everyone today and really just to listen and learn. I am first-time co-author of a biography with my husband, Peter Baker. We wrote a biography that came out this year, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of Jim Baker. And before that, we wrote a book called Kremlin Rising, which is the story really of the first few years of Vladimir Putin's tenure in office, which coincides with the 4 years that we lived and worked in Moscow and across Russia as the bureau chief of the Washington Post. And it's Putin is at the center of the book, but it's not a biography in a conventional sense, although that's part of it. And our next book will be an even, in some ways, more daunting challenge, which will be to try to write, a first crack at a 4-year history of Trump versus Washington, if you will. But we're trying to do kind of an actual look at Trump and his administration, and with a particular emphasis, of course, not just on him and his antics, but the many ways in which he served as an X-ray or a mirror of Washington and its institutions and the institutions of our democracy. But as I said, we're first-time biographers, and I think we probably violated all of the canon of established wisdom when it comes to biography, in the sense of having a subject who is alive, very much so. Although, because we did not cover him as journalists, we are around for the events covered in the book. But since we didn't write about it ourselves, we certainly benefited, in my view, from engaging with Secretary Baker, and he was extremely generous with his time. But in the end, it actually was the documents, the archives, both at Princeton and at Rice University, and the more, I think, conventional tools of a biographer's trade, which really Peter and I found to be, in some ways, the highlight of our departure from journalism. And then the final thing I'll say is it was a huge benefit to us, actually, as working journalists. I was, writing each week for the New Yorker about the sort of upheavals and disruptions of the Trump era. And my husband, as the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, was covering the White House. So for us, it was also an exercise both in biography, but also in time travel. And I think it enriched and deepened our journalism to be able to be thinking about the White House in Washington and how it functioned at a different moment in our recent history, and as a juxtaposition to the sort of tumult that we've seen the last few years. So I found it to be kind of a wonderful, enriching project, both for journalism and as a book project and as biography.
Well, having read and greatly enjoyed the Jim Baker book, I would just say that you still astonish me at your ability to balance these things, because you're writing a notes and comment column every week in the New Yorker, and Peter is writing many articles in the New York Times, and the time management issues and your ability to juggle that is extraordinarily impressive. Just for my my own account, I just my most recent project is a biography of Jimmy Carter called His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life, which came out last fall. And before that, my three previous books were not biographies, although they're often described as such. They're more like slice histories. The first one was The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope, which was a little bit of false billing there. It was about more than his first 100 days. It was really mostly about 2 years in Roosevelt's life, 1932 and 33, with a certain amount of background on how he got the confidence to pull off that conjuring act in 1933. And then I wrote two books about Obama. The first was called The Promise, President Obama, Year One, which I cranked out pretty quickly and was based almost exclusively on more than 200 interviews that I did with people from the Obama administration and his other friends and family. And then I did a second one called The Center Holds, Obama and His Enemies. And that's the title's not holding up so well. If you look at it, the center really didn't seem to hold, but it takes him through his re-election in 2012 and into 2013 when it came out. So it's really about how he came back after that enormous and historically consequential drubbing that the Democrats took in the 2010 midterm elections when they lost so much power. So I think what I would like to do before we open it up for questions, and we have quite a number of people who have tuned in, is to sort of probe what Leo raised, which is the difference between using documents and using interviews, and the advantages and the disadvantages of each. And it reminds me of, I ran into Robert Caro when I was working on one of the Obama books, and he said, well, he had done some interviewing, 30 years ago, but he's mostly relying on documents now. And I said, I wish I had the documents. You've written and we've spoken about how, you need to, as he learned when he was a journalist, turn every page. That was the lesson that his editor at Newsday gave him when he was an investigative reporter. And he couldn't turn every page at the Johnson Library, but he turned a hell of a lot of them. And I didn't have any pages to turn when I was doing my research about Obama. And I said, I have no documents. I feel like I have my hand tied behind my back. And he said, but you have interviews in real time. Or actually, I wouldn't do them in real time. I'd wait like 3 or 4 weeks until after something happened, the dust had settled. And then I would go in and interview people who were in the meetings and knew what had happened. And I did have the advantage of having their stories before they had moss on them and were rounded and turned into, tall tales, which is often what you get in the memoirs and the oral histories. And but I was really handicapped by not having documents. So Leo, since you raised it, maybe you can explore a little more what you meant when you said that you were missing something by not being able to talk to the people that you were writing about.
Socrates refused to ever write down a word. He said, you can't ask questions of a book, it won't answer. And it was Plato who gave us what we think of as Socrates. But, you know, I venerate, as we all do, Robert Caro. And what I remember most vividly is that when he first went to Texas, people wouldn't talk to him. He was this hotshot New York reporter. And that he and his wife, I believe, lived for 2 years in Austin and just hung out in the hill country and won people's trust and, you know, learned what questions they still didn't want to answer. And they would say, well, I don't think I want to talk about his high school years, but here's a guy in Florida. If you can find him, he might tell you. And I was just so envious of, you know, of course, it took his brilliance to know what to do with that. But documents are just documents. And often they're meretricious. Often they, you know, have an axe to grind. So you're always trying to get behind them.
See, the documents, though, while they're inconclusive, and Paul, I'd love it if you would reflect on this, they carry a weight of authenticity that people's memories of, you know, 30, 40 years later do not. Is that right?
Yeah. I have a couple of thoughts here. And again, I forgot to say something when I was hurriedly introducing myself. The reason I agreed to be on this panel, this is where you blush, Jonathan, is because I'm just such a long time admirer of yours. And then I heard Susan Glasser was going to be on it. And like you said a minute ago, how does she balance write a book and file stories every week? It's just totally astonishing to me. More to your question. I can't seem to write anything unless I'm obsessively grounded in the facts, in the documents, in the facts, in the interviews. And then after that, possibly some sentences might start to come together. But if it's up there in the air, it won't work for me. I prove to myself so quickly that I'm a phony. So here's the way I look at it. You get into the archives, and your goal, in a sense, is to fight your way out of the archives. You get in there and you swim in it, but you have to, as quickly as possible, in a sense, get out of it. So I understand the turning of every page, and I also understand what Shirley Povich, that name will ring a bell to some. He worked at the Washington. He worked at the Washington Post 75 years. That's not a typo, because he started as a copy boy. Do you know what he used to say to his hires? He used to say, if you go, it'll happen. I guess that's a version, if you build it, they will come. But if you go, it'll happen. So if you go out there, if you go to West Texas, if you start talking to people, it'll begin to happen in your imagination in the way it can never happen inside those archives. And yet, without those archives, without those documents, you're not going to get anywhere either. So I think it is some mysterious combination of both. And before I surrender the microphone, one quick story. Speaking of who should be on this panel, in addition to this august company, I wrote a book about Robert McNamara way back when, and you know, I write these quasi biographies, these hybrid forms. I couldn't write a real biography of McNamara, so I gave it up and limped back to the Washington Post, and I eventually wrote a book called The Living and the Dead, and it was about McNamara, but it was about 5 other lives streaming in, and that's somehow how I got this quasi biography done. But guess what? At this very moment, in this very esteemed academic, emeritus professor, William Tubman, who wrote a magnificent book about Khrushchev, and it won the Pulitzer and the National Book Critics Circle Award in 2004. He's writing a book about McNamara, but here's the kicker. He's writing it with his brother, who is an esteemed emeritus guy from the New York Times. Everybody would know the name Phil Tubman. So Phil and Bill, the academic and the journalist, are joining together on their first writing project about McNamara. And And Bill Tubman is coming down to my porch on June 16th to talk to me about all this. Both of them wanted to come, and I said, no, I've done thousands of interviews in my life, and I'll be too self-conscious if two people are interviewing me, so we have to choose only one of you. So Bill is coming, not Bill and Phil. But that, to me, is such an interesting idea, to get the academic and the journalist together to do a book about McNamara that will only be 10 times better than the one that I wrote and published finally in 1996.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that that's the case, Paul, because I'm a huge admirer of that book. I got to know McNamara. Newsweek sent me to do the first print interview with him about the Vietnam War when his book came out, almost 25 years after he left government. And Diane Sawyer did the first TV interview. I did the first print interview, and I spent time with him, considerable amount of time with him. And then in later years, I interviewed him 3 or 4 times after that. So I became kind of obsessed with him. And one of the things that greatly impressed me about your book was its almost lyrical quality. And what I wanted to ask you about, and it's a process question, but I think a lot of people on this call will be interested in the answer. How do you decide how much time to devote to the writing and the crafting of the book and the building of these beautiful sentences that you write, as opposed to that research?
So since I spoke long a minute ago, let me speak short here. That is such a profound question, and I've never been able to determine the answer, but I have said it like this to myself and to my writing students. You cannot start too early to write, and you cannot start too late. If you start too early, it'll collapse in on itself. If you start too late, the opposite sort of syndrome clicks in. There's some kind of mystical line in the sand where you can never know it all. In this Frank Lloyd Wright book, I did end it. The last sentence is, you can never get to the end of the knowing. That's when I was driving away from Taliesin, Frank Lloyd Wright's house. You can never get to the end of the knowing. So at some point you have to begin. Didn't Red Smith, the great old journalist from the New York Times, say, oh, writing's not hard. You just open up a vein and begin.
Yeah.
I don't have the answer, but I know that you can't start too early and you can't start too late.
Susan, the same question for you, since you're writing, all week for the New Yorker. How do you decide when to start writing a book?
Well, you're right, Jonathan, that having a deadline in some ways is a very helpful thing. And obviously, when it comes to a book, we didn't really get that right in the Baker book, because we sort of unintentionally ended up taking almost 7 years from the time we started the project, although we weren't really actively working on it necessarily the whole thing, but really were derailed by the Trump era and had planned to finish it back in 2016 and then we were going to be foreign correspondents again, and sort of ended up moving all the way to Jerusalem and then moving all the way back, basically in the space of 3 weeks in my case, and Peter and our son were there for about 4 months. So we're not necessarily the best template for doing this. I wanted to say just quickly to the point about documents versus interviews, because I think that to me was really the best part of this experience, was to sort of see how those two things coexist and intermingle in a way that is different than sort of the journalistic projects that I've done. And I think that they really were interdependent for this particular biography. You're right that people's stories get smoothed over and told again and again and again, especially when your subjects are still around. And in all honesty, Baker was extremely cooperative with us, but also very, very used to telling his stories. And I would say that if you look through the hundreds of hours, and actually there were that much that we had with him, you wouldn't necessarily find some big revelations in there or stories that varied from the previous many oral histories. He'd written 2 memoirs of his own at that point. And so, in a way, the benefit of the interaction with him were a number of things. Number one, he was, I think, just taking the measure of the person, even if he was, in his late 80s by then, as opposed to at the height of his powers. That was certainly useful for us because his personality was, I think, an important part of his success in politics. 2, I would think the sense that it is better to talk to somebody in their late 80s when it comes to things like the challenges of raising a blended family, basically a Brady Bunch from hell type family. In the 1970s, he brought 4 children to his second marriage. His first wife had died at the unexpected age of 39 of cancer. He then married one of her close friends who had 3 children of her own. And they brought these 2 families of very troubled kids together. They had lost parents, essentially. They then had another kid. And, Jim Baker at 85 was a lot more honest and a lot more willing to talk about that than he was had we encountered him, in 1980, when he would not have talked about how he was checking his son into, a substance addiction facility at the same time Nancy Reagan was launching her Just Say No to Drugs campaign. So that's one benefit. The other thing is Baker is not a very introspective person. That's true of a lot of, subjects, I suppose, who might be like him. He, unlike even George H.W. Bush, who at least kept a diary, which actually John Meacham was kind enough to share previously unused portions of Bush's diary with us that dealt with his close relationship with Baker. So that was very helpful. But Baker wasn't even that level of introspective. And so for Peter and I, the ability to interact with Baker, but then to take those observations and to sort of put them into the ephemera. He was a pack rat. And so the one really, I think, provocative and interesting thing that Baker shared about what it meant to be James Addison Baker III, although actually he was the 4th James Addison Baker. And, the burden of this family history, he was the son, grandson, and great-grandson of these lawyers who essentially were builders of the modern Houston. And so, he wasn't going to sort of sit down and open it all up for us, what it meant to be from that. But he did allow that his father's nickname when he was growing up was the Warden. And I thought, that was incredibly revealing. And his friends also, that's what they would call him amongst themselves. And he told us that, and he told us that one time, in fact, he and his friends had gotten busted by the cops for blowing out a streetlight with a BB gun. And they had been taken down to the police station, and every other one of the boys, their parents, one by one, had come into the police station and, picked up their sons and taken them home. Not his father, who never came and said, my boy is going to learn a lesson and he's going to spend the night in jail. And so that might have been the origin of the Warden thing. But just quickly, what I found was that taking that insight and then looking at the literally stacks and stacks of folders that Baker had kept of his father micromanaging his life well into him being a grown man, married, a partner at another law firm with 4 young sons. His father would send him notes and checks. Here's $25 to buy your wife a present for Christmas. Here is money to contribute to a new family station wagon. He paid for the births of Baker's children. He gave the nanny a Christmas bonus. And all the while, he was essentially controlling Baker to an extreme degree. And that's something that Baker could sort of articulate, but we never would have really understood the actual texture of that relationship without being able to sort of dive around in those files without knowing exactly what we were looking at.
Yeah, I would just add one thing in terms of the writing process that I learned from my late editor Alice Mayhew at Simon and Schuster, who's edited all four of my books, and she told me, more than 20 years ago, make sure to not write the introduction until you're done, because you don't really know where you're going when you're writing it, and you will just spin your wheels trying to get the introduction right before you've written the book. So just plunge ahead with your story and come back to the introduction later, which I thought was great advice. And just to your point about Baker, I think pretty much everybody who, any of us or anybody else at this conference has written biographies of, has some kind of daddy issues that can be explored. And the title of my first chapter is Daddy and Hot. Hot was Jimmy Carter's father's nickname for him, short for Hot Shot, which he would sometimes say respectfully and sometimes say in a kind of a contemptuous way. So all of that is great grist for biographers. Leo, did your subjects have daddy issues?
Oh, sure. Sometimes they'd lost a parent. Sometimes they've been rejected by their parents. I mean, there's complicated stories of that kind. But once again, it's 250 years ago. What we basically know about somebody's childhood back then is what they're able to tell us. There's nobody else was writing it down at the time. And they've got their own romantic or bitter or other kind of spin on it. I do what I can with that, but you always have to be cautious. Am I understanding what really happened or just how this person in middle age wanted to remember it? I want to say one other thing briefly. All three of you are swimming in the same ocean that your subjects did. Often you were contemporary with them, even if you didn't know them. And that is such a rich resource. It might be possible to take it for granted because it's our culture. But again, I'm looking at people far away in a very different culture. You may know David Hume was a historian as well as a philosopher. And he says complacently, well, we have the privilege of watching the human race pass before us without those disguises that perplex their contemporaries. Who are you kidding? You write about ancient Rome as you know more than an ancient Roman did. I'll say one more thing. A book I've always admired is Only Yesterday by Frederick Lewis Allen. It's the history of the 20s, very rich cultural history as well as political. And it was published in 1931. So the Depression was still just getting going, and Hoover was still in the White House, and Allen was in a position to tell the story of the 20s as if he was still inside it.
It's interesting. He later did a book called Since Yesterday.
Yes, I've read that. It's not as good.
Not as good. Yeah, like a lot of sequels, it doesn't.
Yeah, I think Through the Looking Glass is the only sequel that's as good as the first book.
But just to pursue a point that you made, like, how do you, when you're not living in that culture, when it's a couple hundred years ago or more, how do you write with the confidence you need to pull the reader along when you're in some ways, I think inevitably, maybe pretending to more knowledge of that era than anybody could possibly have 200 years later?
Well, my hero among historians is actually Edward Gibbon, because he almost invented the process of sharing with the reader the quest to figure out what went on. So instead of just pontificating, he will tell you this evidence is very shaky. Let me see what we can do if we think about it. And that's a kind of exciting quest in itself. But I'll say one other thing. What you said about the writing the preface last, I do that, but I've ended up not even writing a single chapter until I'm ready to write the whole book, because I never know what will be valuable somewhere else. And I formed the habit of stacking all my notes on a pool table within different categories so I can start thinking how to maneuver to combine them. I showed it to a friend of mine. He said, table of contents. And in a way, that was true.
Yeah, everybody has their own weird system. There's some parts about my system that are maybe among my deepest secrets because they would be almost embarrassing to talk about. I don't know if any of you feel the same way. The level of disorganization at the front end, not having my ducks lined up properly. So for me, it's much more chaotic. I know that a lot of people can't write without a real outline, that they have down. I've talked to many authors who they can't do it without the outline that tells them exactly where they're going. And I'm completely the opposite of that. I like write from the inside out, and I just start writing, and then the thing gets longer, and then it gets shorter, and everything's rearranged as I'm going. And it's a very haphazard, not very attractive process to use. I read Evan Thomas's fine biography of Sandra Day O'Connor recently, and she used that word attractive or unattractive many times a day to describe her reaction to various things. And I think in some ways my process is not very attractive. Paul, you look like
Jonathan,
you.
can I say a word about process? I was once a neighbor on Capitol Hill in Washington of the late Edmond Morris, and we all know who he is. He died a little too early last year, but his Theodore Roosevelt books are monumental. His most recent project had been about Thomas Edison. He was simultaneously working on the third volume of TR while he was working on what turned out to be his much maligned biography of Ronald Reagan. And he invited me over to his home. And he had, I can't say which floor for sure, but one of his subjects was up on the third floor and the other subject was on the first floor. And never the twain should meet, but he took me to see, talking about process, the work in process to each floor for each subject. And I kind of limped home in shame because he had boxes like those old hard catalog boxes that you pulled out so wonderfully, those wooden, on 3x5 index cards, all of his facts. And his wife, who was also an esteemed biographer, who's now deceased, was writing about Claire Booth Luce, and she had her 3x5 cards. Jonathan, I'm like you. I do have my own, which is certainly, I mean, it's chaotic, but it makes a certain sense to me, my process. Remember that movie about the pods falling off the back of the truck? They keep multiplying and replicating, a 50s horror movie. I start with folders, manila folders, and then I subdivide and subdivide and subdivide and subdivide. That's kind of my process.
Mine too. Like something will start out as a chapter and then it'll end up as two chapters. But I want to just say something about Edmond Morris. I think now, and I think even he would appreciate that now that he's gone, it's time for at least a short assessment of his career. I see him as a kind of a tragic figure because he was arguably
Yes.
top rank of most gifted biographers of his generation. And then he took two wrong turns, not just one, but two. So in the Reagan biography, I hesitate to even call it a biography because he creates characters in it
Yes.
and he violates the only rule that any of us have. and that is not just a silly rule. You can't make it up. And if you make it up, you cross, what now it's a cliche, but you cross a red line, and it's then fiction and really can't be called biography. And, all of us work so hard to be scrupulous in our reverence for fact. And we're living in a society where there's been this retreat from the kingdom of fact. And when an esteemed biographer does that, every savage review of that book was well deserved.
It's tragic. It's tragic.
It's tragic.
It's tragic, Jonathan. And do you know what he told me about that? Because, I was a friend of his and a neighbor. And so this is long after the visit, I'm telling you. But he, first of all, he accepted a contract for $3 million. How do you give that back? This was to complete the TR and to do the Ronald Reagan. And he got at sea. And it was an act of total desperation, he told me, for him to invent a character named Edmond Morris, who went to college with Dutch. And he said it was my only way out.
Why didn't he just write there was plenty of biographical material about Reagan. He wasn't that hard to figure out, and maybe he wasn't as complex and interesting as Theodore Roosevelt or Jimmy Carter, who Kai Bird and I have written about, and his complexity is part of what makes him so interesting. And Reagan was much simpler than that, but there's tremendous epic qualities to his life. I just took part in a 4-part documentary about Reagan that a director named Matt Turnauer did. And, Edmund Morris could have easily, I shouldn't say easily, because these are hard things to do, but just punting on that, it was just the wrong thing to do.
He somehow got blocked. Yeah, he told me that Reagan was opaque. But I agree with you. I don't know what happened.
There's plenty there. Then his last book on Edison, there's great material on Edison, but he wrote it in reverse chronological order. It was like
in reverse order.
That Benjamin Button movie or something, which was interesting in a movie, but this again comes from Alice Mayhew, and sometimes the simplest advice is the best. One of the great and easier things about biographies than other books is you have an organizing principle. It's called the chronology of the person's life, beginning, middle, and end, and so that in some ways makes while biographies are so much harder than other works of nonfiction in many, many respects, and even though I may engage in another one, sometimes I say to my friends, shoot me if I write another biography because they're so much harder, but they're easier in terms of the organizing principle of them, which is chronological. And so for him to mess with that was a gimmick. He was trying to be cute. I don't know what he was trying to do, but he blew the fact that he was a brilliant writer. And if he had just put it in chronological order, it would have probably been the greatest biography of Thomas Edison ever written. So anyway, I think in some ways his career can be a little bit of a lesson for everybody that, when you enter into the deep woods of despair, which all of us I think can do from time to time, it's a very lonely business. As they say in The Godfather, this is the business we have chosen, right? And it can be a very lonely one, but you have to keep your head and not look for some sort of easy way out, because it probably won't end well if you do. So I'm sorry to lay it on him. He's not here to defend himself, but I think he would admit that when somebody's gone, you need a hard-eyed assessment of their life. I think let's take some questions. We've got a number of great ones here in the chat. Does Paul Hendrickson or others have any comments about writing to photographs, using photos as a taking off point versus working them in later to illustrate already the already written text?
Yes, I've done a lot of that, and I continue to do a lot of that. I seem to think visually, but why don't I pass the baton here and see if someone else has a response as well.
I work on long ago people, but I always work with portraits and images of their world right from the start. And I think most, certainly academic biographers, finish the book and then they outsource the pictures to somebody who scrambles them together. And it's much more interesting if you're thinking with the pictures all the way through, just as much, I think, as with photographs.
So I want to, Kai Bird had an interesting defense of Edmond Morris. Kai writes, in defense of Edmond Morris, despite the fictional character, I still think the book is the best thing we have about Reagan. The fictional character allowed him, being Morris, to speculate about Reagan. I once told Edmond that I thought Reagan was an empty vessel, and Edmond responded, I'm sorry you feel that way. What's interesting to me about this, and Kai, maybe you might want to respond, or we can figure out a way to let you in so you can do it directly, is that if Morris didn't think that Reagan was an empty vessel, I always assumed that's why he invented the character, because he thought he was an empty vessel. And if he didn't think that, if he thought there was enough in the vessel, then why didn't he do it without raising these doubts? So I guess my response to what Kai said is that while there are some outstanding and quite deep insights into Reagan that are in that book, all you ultimately have in a biographer is trust. And if you can't trust that what he is writing happened, then no matter how powerful the insights are, the whole edifice crumbles because you don't have that basic trust that you're getting as close as he can get to the real story. Now, I never use that word definitive because I don't think anybody can be, I don't think there's any such thing as a definitive biography because, as William James said, nobody can know the contents of another man's heart. And so definitive is impossible. But you have to stay within those, to my mind, just my opinion, you have to stay within those parameters of getting as close to the truth as you can without taking shortcuts, without cooking quotes or doing other things that are not kosher. That doesn't mean that all of the standards of journalism have to be the same. For instance, I check quotes with as many of my sources as I can, which is sometimes frowned on in journalism because you're giving them a chance to take something back. But I don't think you're playing the same. You don't want to play gotcha games if you can in either journalism or history. And there are other things, sometimes giving questions in advance if that's what sources require, where you don't have to abide by all of the rules of journalism. But when it comes to not making it up, I think the rules are the same. I'd be interested, Susan. Go ahead. You're here. Great.
I'm here. I can respond quickly. I was unmuted. No, John, I agree with you. I mean, I think Edmond Morris made a mistake in doing what he did. But it was an interesting mistake. And I think my little dialogue with him about Reagan being an empty vessel sort of underscored why he did it. He was frustrated with the empty vessel problem. And he, in desperation, decided, I need to find a way to comment about Reagan because all I got are those damn speeches he's given over and over and over again. And, it was a mistake, but it was a mistake he committed out of frustration. And I agree, you're right, there are plenty of sources on Reagan and he could have told the story in a conventional way. But as we see from his book on Edison, Edmond had a sort of quirkiness to him. He really was bored with the format, I guess. I don't know. He was willing to experiment. And with Reagan, he was also coming back to the empty vessel thing. He denied it to me. Oh, I feel sorry you feel that way. So he was also very defensive of Reagan, and his politics were surprisingly conservative. And he wanted to write a sympathetic or empathetic biography of Reagan, but I think he really ran into the empty vessel problem. The guy was a mystery to his own family. Anyway, I go on too long.
Hey, Kai, would a way out of this have been for Edmond to have stumbled on this trick of inventing this character named Edmond Morris, who goes to college with Ronald Reagan, publish the book, and then don't market it otherwise? It's not a biography. Market it as something else.
Yeah, that would have been a solution, a kind of a almost historical fiction.
Well, actually, one of the reviewers assigned, I won't say his name, but one of the reviewers assigned to write the review of that book, Dutch, turned in his review, and the book review editor had to go back to him and say, do you realize that the new source that you're talking about in your review is a fictional character? So, at least one reviewer was fooled completely by the device.
Wow.
Again, in Edmond's defense, if you read that book, it's very clear he actually makes up footnotes for the fake character Edmond Morris, and it becomes pretty clear, that this is a fictional device that he's introduced. But the rest of the book is all true and well footnoted and documented, and it's a biography in a conventional sense. But yeah, it was a terrible thing to do.
There's an interesting question here that is directed, I guess, at all of us, but I think they wanted Leo to take a crack at it. While lines are, of course, blurred, I think one difference between professorial and journalistic biographies might relate to the perceived audience for each. I'm curious who the panelists try to write for and how their intended audiences affect the structure, content, and process of their work. This is very much on point for the theme of this panel. Leo, do you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, sure. Well, as a lifelong academic, those are the people I'm not writing for. I began my career writing to the few hundred people who were specialists in my narrow field. And that's a completely different game and a very competitive one, and lots of professional rivalries there. And it was a joy to emerge from that ghetto, really, and write for the intelligent general reader. And I will add one thought. Yale University Press has been my press for years because they do wonderful crossover books. Still has to send every manuscript out to 2 academic readers to say whether it's worth publishing. And again, one of the 2 will say, well, I already know all this stuff and this book is not needed. Well, I didn't even know everything I put in that book, but there's more reasons to write it than that. And because I use illustrations, 3 different reviewers have said this is just a coffee table book, as though their pictures are unworthy of a real book. So my ideal reader is every thoughtful person who might be interested in one of these lives.
So this gets into some of my pet peeves with academia. The jealousies and resentments there are rooted in the fact that you're a much better writer than these academic nitpickers are, and this is connected to a kind of a rivalry between the professional historians and the journalistic amateurs, for lack of a better word. which in recent years has eased. So there are now quite a number of journalists who are in the Society of American Historians, for instance, and some other professional organizations that had been dominated by scholars. But I always thought that the greatest scholars were like you. They could sort of swing from both sides of the plate. They could write for the academic audience when they were doing their dissertation or early in their career, and then also write for a more general audience. And I think the people who can't do that, it drives them crazy when they see people who can. And it reminds me of some of what Kissinger said about academics and their pettiness. And so I don't mean to pick on academics as a group, because there are many brilliant ones, I'm sure, in attendance who write brilliantly and do much of the best work that our culture has. But I'm just glad that this kind of long Cold War between academics and historians seems to be warming up. I think that's good news for everybody. Let's see. Leo, just there's a sort of almost a follow-up to this. It was written before this. The questioner says, my own view is that biography escapes the hegemony of some other disciplines that use patches of a life in the prosecution of various theses in their disciplines. So does biography, it's a great question. Does it free you of having to, worry about, introducing some sort of a thesis, an academic thesis that is supposedly some new analytical contribution to the discipline? Does it let you go and free you in a certain way?
Oh yeah, it's totally liberating, because during my professional lifetime, what's called theory has really taken over, and a book is not worth writing unless you can translate it into what Foucault would have said if he was writing that book, or whoever the model is. What I find is working, for example, on Rousseau or now on Casanova, is there's wonderful, penetrating, thoughtful commentary by non-academics who write essayistically about what made this person tick. How do we understand this weird episode in the life? Which is invaluable to me, but biographers normally ignore all that because it's not, within their blinkers.
Susan, how do you, is a very good question also that I think a lot of people are wondering about. How do you handle sources that refuse to talk, and there is a reason why they're refusing to talk? And it says, I'm not an investigative journalist, and I'm wondering if you have tips for getting around those who stonewall.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I know our time is up for this panel, and we've sort of just scratched the surface here. I think it's been really interesting for me to listen to everyone's interesting insights today. What I found is that in terms of a biography, especially if you have long time to play it out, people are very eager to participate in history, and that's much more of a challenge when you're on a deadline of daily or magazine journalism on sources, or ultimately the question is what you're getting out of sources in some ways, and what are you listening to? And this insight of Caro's really does apply in terms of, you might have to go back one or two or three times to really figure out what it is that the person is meant to be telling you or might be telling you. And certainly I think there's a reluctance to engage often on, people are more willing to participate in a big project, I think, than they are to participate in a forthcoming way. And for me, that's a lot of the challenge of reporting in any of the bigger projects that I've undertaken, books or magazine. And, that's where being able to go back at something, the biggest thing that gets people to participate, certainly in Washington, is a sense that you already know something that they need to engage with in some way. And that is, I think, where preparation and listening comes into play. And to me, that's been the experience. It's why a lot of great reporting, certainly in a big magazine piece, but I think also in a book, when you're dealing with live subjects, a lot of the best stuff comes at the very end, in my experience in reporting, because you're pushing and pushing and pushing. And it's only when people are really forced to reckon with what it is that you actually know, often, that some final crucial details will come into place. Although I will say that, there were many things that Peter and I worried about, how do we get Baker to acknowledge this? Or, when we go over this, is he going to actually cop to, for example, this great act of revenge in his one and only effort at being a political candidate himself, as opposed to working with other political candidates. He ran for Texas Attorney General in 1978 and flopped pretty spectacularly. And he harbored a grudge from that race for a long, long time, that the Houston Chronicle, his hometown newspaper, had not endorsed him in that race. And years later, when he was the Treasury Secretary, he managed basically to force the owners of the Houston Chronicle, which was a nonprofit, to sell. And it was a pretty straightforward act of revenge. We had found out about it in the course of working on the book. And it was, we had long lists of questions for Baker when we would go back to him. We'd have been doing other research and other reporting and interviews in the meantime. And, Peter and I agreed that he was going to go see him in Texas, and that we would leave that one along with some other sensitive things for the very end of the interview, so that at least if he got really pissed off, we'd have gotten something else out of the conversation. And Peter very gingerly brought it up, and Baker was like, yeah, did I tell you about that? It was fantastic. It was like the best revenge ever. I'm so proud of that. And of course, it was not something that he had ever copped to in the course of his career. It would have been a big story at the time. It obviously has implications to this day in Texas. So, to me, it's really about having as much information and ammunition as possible when you're trying to get a source to speak with you, and for them to be able to take you seriously enough for what it is you want out of them. But again, thank you everyone for all the great insights today. I enjoyed listening to this very much. Thank you.
So I've gotten an indication that if you have to go, thank you so much for taking part. I don't know, Leo and Paul, what your schedules are. I'm hearing from the powers that be that we can keep this Zoom meeting open for about another 15 minutes now. If we want to keep going, I'm happy to do that. Another good question. As an art historian, I encourage biographers to look at images. Oh, I'm sorry, that this is sort of similar to what we already covered. Okay, this is an important question. Susan, while you're still here, maybe you can tackle this, and Paul as well. And Leo from some 18th, 19th century newspapers. One question I've heard on some other panels at the conference is this: in judging the validity of a source, how do you evaluate newspapers, particularly those from a different era or place? With sites like newspapers.com, accessing papers about anyone becomes much easier. I have my own thoughts, but participants might be interested in hearing your answers. So, Susan, why don't we just pick up on that Houston Chronicle point? I mean, how much could you rely on stories in the Houston Chronicle or the Houston Post or the Austin Statesman? And these are not fact-checked the way the New Yorker is. So how did you handle information that you got from old newspapers?
Well, I think it was valuable, but the truth is we were so lucky to have such extensive cooperation. And so I would say, the real core of this book is almost certainly not in the secondary sources, but it really was in either the combination of original interviews and documents that hadn't been reviewed before. His archive had not been opened up at all. And, it was valuable, I would say, in looking at, say, coverage of Baker throughout the 80s, which was sort of his apogee in Washington, to get a sense of how he was seen. And also one of the stories that we're telling is his extreme skill in the care and feeding of journalists. And so understanding his relationship with journalists, both in shaping the coverage of him and of the Reagan administration. I did listen with interest to the conversation about the Reagan historical fiction, or whatever we want to call it. I would certainly agree with you, Jonathan, that at a moment when it's more important than ever that the credibility of scholars, experts, and journalists and historians be unassailable. I think it was a terrible black mark for the profession. You can get a lot of insight from historical fiction, but misleading people in such a way and making things up is not the business that we're in, certainly. And by the way, though, I am very sympathetic. We also had to grapple with the question of who was Ronald Reagan. What kind of a character was he? And was Jim Baker being on the level with us in how he spoke about this crucial but sort of cipher-like relationship that he had with Ronald Reagan? Baker's extreme sensitivity toward the critiques of himself from his time running the Reagan White House and forward. He was under constant assault, essentially, from the Reagan revolutionaries, from the far right of the party, who saw him throughout his time in Washington as an interloper, as a moderate, as someone who was going to compromise with the establishment, or with Democrats, or with Soviets. And so, establishing his relationship with Reagan, whatever it actually was a very important thing to Baker personally, and him politically as well. And so that meant there was an odd sort of void. He had to portray him to us as someone that he could essentially he could take full control of his White House, coming in as an outsider, and yet he was at pains not to portray him as a void, or as someone who wasn't actively involved. And so, that was a tightrope that forced us to consider previous portrayals of Reagan as well. And, in terms of evaluating journalism and where it's at, I would say that, again, putting people's names to things, having documentary evidence, multiple sources to things. There's a reason those are the conventions in journalism, as well as in good history and good academic work, because it's that level of, whatever level of transparency you can achieve with these things is important. I was very frustrated, I will say, doing the part about Baker before he comes to Washington, or before he's a big figure. There's very little of the kind of rigorous independent journalism that we come to rely on, and that's so important right now. And so there wasn't the kind of writing in the Houston Chronicle that I would have liked about Jim Baker and his family earlier in his career. And there wasn't the kind of books that would have been helpful as secondary sources. And so, for us, I think that was a benefit, but it was also something that was missing.
So I want Paul to answer that, but before, I just want to note that one of the things that really depresses me is that the demise of local journalism, no matter how shoddy it might have been in some cases, at least at the Carter Library, I had clips from these tiny newspapers all over the state of Georgia, and who were seeing Jimmy Carter when he's running for governor in 1966 and again in 1970, and their perspective on them was very helpful for me in sort of placing myself in that time, or their perspective on Carter when he was chairman of the county school board in Sumter County. And I despair at what it's going to be like in the future when, you don't have letters, because letters have gone out of fashion, and emails and texts are just not the same. And you don't have these local newspapers covering things. So, Paul, what is your sense of the role that local newspapers have played in your coverage?
I think Susan spoke eloquently about it, and I think you just said it as well, that newspapers have this uncanny ability to help you imagine yourself there, to place you there. But to quote Ben Bradley, if he is the true source of this wonderful quote, newspapers are the first rough draft of history. So you have to always have that jaundiced, raised eyebrow. I don't want to say jaundiced. Let me withdraw that. Raised eyebrow. And yes, any possible way you can check and cross-check again. But newspapers are crucial and valuable for the local placing of yourself in the shoes of your subject. And I shudder to think too, with the demise of newspapers across the country, and as you say, letters are gone. How are biographies going to be written? Not, I hope, I pray, in the way that Edmond Morris wrote his, and Pace Edmond. He was always, if I was speaking, sounding in the least ill toward him, he was very kind to me, always very kind to me. He recommended me for a fellowship or two. I would not have wanted to have lived inside the darkness that I think he was living in trying to get that book done.
I'm going to just take the prerogative of saying that I believe, and I could be wrong about this, but I believe if we checked it, that it was actually Phil Graham, the
who said,
late
first rough draft, yeah.
Graham, who hired Ben Bradley.
I think he did. I think it was Phil.
Killed himself. It was Phil Graham who said,
yeah, I think you're right.
First rough draft of history, but I think you've spoken beautifully, as you always do, to this question, and we just have a few minutes more. I want to turn to all three of you to see if you can put in capsule form what your best advice to a first-time biographer would be. If you could sort of boil it all down to a couple of thoughts. Leo, why don't we start with you?
Well, because I work on people from so long ago, there's a lot of accumulated interpretation in this existing biographies. So I think for the three of you, the challenge would be totally different. I don't think I should even take up time.
Susan, is there anything that, if you had to do it over again, or when you do it, if you were to do another biography, that you had learned that maybe could have helped you save time, although you're very good at that generally?
Well, I'm sure there's a million ways we could have done it better and faster. I think, one thing we struggled with throughout is, in the course of this book, we started doing it in the Obama presidency. And of course, Trump was not even foreseen, and yet was the sort of 4 years of us finishing the book coincided with his presidency, and with this disruption of the Republican Party, which is a big facet of the book itself, which is the story of sort of how this kind of Southern inflected Republican Party came to be in the first place. And so, we asked Baker again and again and again about Trump, and were frustrated every single time with his answers. And so I guess the one thing that, we came away sort of reluctantly concluding from that is, you have to be able to listen to your subject. And if he's telling you something, or you're asking the same question over and over again, or, I think this applies to documents as well, or, not necessarily just to live conversations, but don't look away from that thing that doesn't really make sense about your subject, whatever it is. But, try to listen to her or him. And in the end, what Baker ended up telling us was an explanation that he could find Donald Trump to be nuts and crazy and infuriating and terrible, and yet also vote for him twice. And as infuriating and sort of hard to understand as that is, I think in the end, it tells you why 70 million Americans voted for Donald Trump to a certain extent. And it helped us rather than fighting that. I think, there was a couple of years where we kept saying, well, okay, well, we'll just, this time he's going to be it. Or, he would say, well, maybe I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. And then he would say the next time, no, don't say I'm going to do that. And that actually was a very instructive for us, seeing Baker and his equivocations and trying to find, where the political wind is blowing and things that we hadn't had the chance to observe about him. So that's a long-winded way of saying, listen to your subject, even if it's hard or even if what they're saying to you doesn't necessarily make sense.
And I guess I would just add in conclusion that I think everybody on the panel and probably everybody at the conference who has written books would agree that persistence is the key thing. And even to that question about how do you get to hard to reach sources, if you come at them over and over, not in an obnoxious way, but you use one contact to leverage another contact. So you say, well, so-and-so's talked, and then they're more likely to speak to you if they know that a friend of theirs has already spoken to you. But just persistence in general, because an awful lot of people have trouble finishing. And so if you don't worry too much about how it's going to be received or what you're going to think of your book or yourself, and just press on to the finish line. And I think this is where journalists do have an advantage, because we're so used to writing on deadline, where you just have to get it done at a certain point. If you can impose those deadlines on yourself and be persistent, that whether you're writing an academic biography or a non-academic one, you can get done, which is half the battle. So we are out of time now. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and to Leo and Paul and Susan for being on this panel. And I hope to see all of you at some point soon next year when we're in person. Thanks.